table saw, arguably the centerpiece of your shop. It's where your projects are going to begin to take shape, and it's where masterpieces are made. But if you want to make master craftsman pieces of work, you're going to have to learn the safety and operation of this tool first. That's what we're going to do in this video. If you like what you see here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss any of our weekly videos. Let's get to it. Before you make any sort of a cut, I don't care if it's a rip cut, a cross cut, anything, you need to make sure that you have the proper safety equipment ready to go. So number one, eye protection. We got to protect our eyes. So make sure that you have some sort of safety goggle on that's going to protect your eyes. Number two, secure your clothing. Roll your sleeves up. Make sure that you don't have any necklaces or headphones or any strings that can get caught in that blade, okay? Number three, we want to have a push stick at the ready. Now push sticks can be either manufacturer made or they can be shop made. Doesn't really matter as long as you use one. General rule of thumb, if you are cutting something that is smaller than 6 inches in width, you need to use a push stick. I personally use a push stick anytime I can stretch my fingers out and touch both the fence and the blade with my fingers. And a rip cut is cutting with the grain. A cross cut is going to be cutting across the grain. To make a rip cut, the first thing we want to do is set up our blade, okay? So our blade height needs to be about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch above the top of our material so that we get a nice clean cut and the blade doesn't bind as it's going through. So I slide my material up to the edge of the blade and then I raise my saw blade until it's at the right height. Now an easy trick here is rather than measuring and making sure that you're 1/8 to 1/4 inch above the material, you look at the teeth of the saw, they stick up, there's a little valley underneath. If that valley, the bottom of that valley is at the top of your board, you're good. My blade height is set. Next thing I want to do is set my fence. Okay, now the fence is going to be what holds my board in position. I never ever want to make a freehand cut where I'm not using the fence. Okay, if you do something like that, your board can move, which can then bind in the blade and cause a kickback. Let's talk about kickback. Kickback occurs when the blade of the saw catches a piece of your board and shoots it back out. I have seen a kickback shoot all the way from the table saw to that wall back there. That's a lot of force. You want to make sure you're not behind that when that happens. Okay, if it hits you, it's going to hurt. So we want to make sure that we don't have kickback. A couple of things that are going to reduce your chance of kickback. Having that blade height set properly is going to reduce it. Having a fence that is locked in place is going to reduce it. Also important, this riving knife. Okay, the riving knife is going to keep the edge of your board from coming back onto the blade to kick it back, okay? If you don't have a riving knife, you increase your chance of kickback exponentially. Now there are a couple types of riving knives. You can have one that's freestanding like this so that you can see the blade. You can also use one that has a guard on it, okay? Now this guard that comes with this particular saw is super nice. It's got the riving knife built in, which raises and lowers at the same height as the blade. It's got these anti-kickback pawls so that if your board does start to come back towards you, it kind of catches them. And then it's got this guard here that's going to keep your fingers hopefully out from the blade. So using a guard when you can is a great idea. Let's get back to the rip cuts. So we always want to use a fence or some sort of a device that's going to allow us to push this through in a straight line. So I want to rip this down to 6 inches wide. So I'm going to set my fence at 6 inches and I'm going to lock it in place. Again, that locking it in place is key so that the fence doesn't move during your cut. You should always double check and make sure that your saw blade is actually the distance that you want it from the fence. Okay, don't just assume that the fence is accurate. So we've done that, we're set up. Let's talk about body position. We want to make sure that our body is out of the way of the back of the fence, or the back of the table saw. Okay, so that if there is a kickback, we don't get hit by it. Okay, so I like to position myself on the fence side of the table saw because generally, if I'm going to get a kickback, it's going to kind of fly out that way. So I'm going to position myself on the fence side of the table saw, and I want to be able to reach all the way to my outfeed table. Okay, so my front hand has one job, my back hand has the other job. My front hand's job is going to be to hold it both to the table and to the fence. So it's not doing any pushing, it's just holding it down. And you're gonna notice that as I push through, I kind of walk my fingers up the board so they're not getting too close to the blade. My backhand is going to be doing all of the pushing of the material. I want to have my push stick at the ready. I've got it right here so that when I'm ready for it, I can use it. Standing here, I'm ready to make my cut. Let's do this. You'll notice that I have a piece of scrap wood in here. I want to wait until that blade has stopped spinning before I go to remove my scrap wood. Okay, so now I can remove my scrap wood and I can get rid of it. I always want to make sure that I have a clear table, outfeed table and table before I begin making any cuts. If you're going to make a second cut on there, make sure you remove your scrap wood, remove your stock so that you don't run into it and cause binding. Let's talk about the crosscut. A crosscut is cutting across the grain in a piece of wood. You can do it on the table saw, but you can also do it on a miter saw. The miter saw is actually designed for the purpose of the crosscut. So if you want to see how to do that, check out my video on safety and operation of the miter saw. To do it on a table saw, there's a couple of safety things that we've got to talk about. To make a crosscut on the table saw, or really any cut that's going to be wider than it is long, you don't want to use a fence. Reason being is the surface area that you have to keep against the fence is not as much as the surface area rocking on the table. So as you go to push this through, there's a chance that your board is going to move and it's going to cause a kickback towards you. So instead of using a fence, we want to use something like a miter gauge. Now a miter gauge has angles that you can use on it. It also is designed for a 90-degree cut, so I can slide it into the miter gauge slot here. There's a track that allows it to cut here, and I can cut through. That's going to give me a safer way to cut this crosscut. Even better than the miter gauge is going to be a sled. Now a sled is a tool that is going to give you a fence across the back, or crosscut fence. So this one in particular has this wide fence. It fits in the miter slots just like the miter gauge did, but it allows me to push against this and doesn't allow the board to move side to side, okay? So to use a sled, you're going to do the same basic things that we did before. You're gonna set your blade height. You're not gonna use the fence, but you are gonna set your depth here or your cut here, and then you wanna make sure that when you make this cut, that your fingers are not where the blade is gonna go. So set my blade height here. Same thing, valley of the tooth at the top of the board. Slide this over to where I want to make the cut. My hands are going to be outside where the blade is going to be. And again, we don't want to remove our material till that blade is stopped. Remove your material, and you've made a nice crosscut. Another secondary use for the table saw is going to be to cut bevels and miters, okay? So, to cut a miter on the table saw, you're gonna want to tip the blade to whatever angle you want. So we're gonna tip this to a 45-degree angle. If I am cutting across, I'm still going to use the table saw sled here, the crosscut sled. I want to make sure that I reset the blade height because now that it's at an angle, it's going to be a little bit lower. So again, I'm going to bring my board over and I'm going to bring that blade height up until the valley of the tooth is sitting at the top of the board. Set it on my crosscut where I want it to cut. Bring my sled back. Turn this on. And I can make that cross-cut miter. I can get a nice clean cut there. If I want to make a ripped miter or a bevel, I can use the fence again and I can rip this in the same fashion. So I can set your blade height to the top of the board. Bring your fence in into the desired depth of the bevel here. We're just gonna take a wee little bit off right here, lock my fence in place. I'm within 6 inches, so I need to make sure that I have my push stick. And I can make that bevel on my edge. Hey, so that's really the basics on how to safely and effectively operate the table saw. We learned how to do rip cuts, cross cuts, miters, and bevels. There's a ton more that you can do on this versatile machine, but we'll save those for other videos. If you liked what you saw here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our weekly content. Until then, thanks for watching.